When I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, I found my daughter-in-law wearing my robe while my husband said, "Accept the divorce settlement or get out." And before I continue, if stories like this touch you, make sure to subscribe. That way you won't miss what happens next. I smiled and waved to my son, who was behind the door. We had been waiting for this moment, and then my millionaire son said something that makes me happy to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment from which city you are watching me. That way, I'll know how far my story has reached. It was 3:15 in the morning when my bladder woke me up. At 64 years old, these nocturnal interruptions had become as routine as having my morning coffee. I slowly sat up in bed, being careful not to wake Richard, who was snoring softly beside me after 38 years of marriage. My bare feet touched the cold wooden floor as I headed to the master bathroom. The house was completely silent, wrapped in that particular stillness that only exists in the deepest hours of the night. But when I reached the hallway, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Voices, whispering voices coming from the living room. My heart started beating faster. Robbers, an intruder. But as I strained my ears, I recognized one of the voices. It was Richard. My husband was awake, talking to someone in urgent whispers. With my pulse racing, I crept stealthily down the hall, staying pressed against the wall. The words became clearer with every step I took towards the room. "We can't go on like this indefinitely, Jessica. She's going to suspect something." Jessica. My daughter-in-law's name echoed in my ears like a slap. What was Jessica doing in my house at 3 in the morning? And why was Richard talking to her in secret? I cautiously peeked around the corner of the hall, and what I saw broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. There was my daughter-in-law, my son David's wife, dressed only in my navy blue silk robe, the one I had received as a Christmas Eve dinner gift last year. Her blonde hair fell in waves over her bare shoulders, and her lips were swollen in a way that left no doubt as to what she had been doing. Richard was sitting on the edge of the sofa, still in his underwear, running his hands through his gray hair in desperation. "Helen is smarter than you think," Jessica whispered, adjusting my robe with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. "We have to be more careful." I know," Richard murmured, his voice heavy with guilt and frustration. "But David is starting to ask questions about why you come over so often when he's away on a business trip." My world swayed. My son David traveled constantly for work, at least 2 weeks a month. And during those absences, apparently his wife had been visiting my husband. How long had this been going on? "Listen to me, Richard." Jessica's voice hardened, losing that false sweetness she always used with me. "Accept the divorce settlement or go live on the street. Helen is no longer of any use to you. She's old, boring, and frankly, she's becoming a burden. If you believe no one deserves to be treated this way, tap the like button. It helps this story reach more people. It's time for you to be free." I felt as if I had been punched in the chest. Divorce settlement. What was she talking about? Richard sighed deeply. "It's not that easy, Jessica. The house is in both our names, and after so many years," Jessica laughed scornfully. "Helen is a traditional woman. Give her an ultimatum and she'll melt like butter. Tell her she can stay in the guest room or find somewhere else to live, that you and I deserve to be happy." The world stopped around me. This woman, whom I had taken in like a daughter, whom I had comforted during her marital problems, whom I had invited to all our family dinners, was planning to dismantle my entire life. "And if she resists," Jessica continued, her voice now as cold as ice, "we can always say she's losing her mind. At her age, no one would question a diagnosis of early onset dementia." Tears began to well up in my eyes, but something strange happened. Instead of feeling only pain, a strange calm began to take over me. Because at that moment, I saw a shadow moving at the opposite end of the hallway. David, my son, was there, hidden in the shadows, listening to every word of the conversation. His eyes met mine through the gloom, and I saw in them a mixture of pain, anger, and something else, something that looked like relief. He raised a finger to his lips, asking me to be silent, and then he gave me an almost imperceptible signal. A smile, not a smile of amusement, but a smile that said, "It was about time." And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, I smiled too. I raised my hand and gave a little wave to my son, who had been waiting in the shadows, apparently as prepared for this moment as I should have been. Richard continued talking to Jessica, oblivious to our presence. "Okay," he finally murmured. "I'll talk to her tomorrow." I'll give her the options. Accept an amicable separation, or we put her in a situation where she has no alternative? Jessica completed, her voice full of cruel satisfaction. David approached silently down the hallway, and I knew something was about to happen. Something that had been planned long before tonight. The expression on my son's face was not one of surprise or shock. It was one of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. As I watched my daughter-in-law adjust my robe and continue planning my destruction, a strange certainty settled in my chest. This betrayal, as devastating as it was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something completely different. The first time I suspected something was a Tuesday afternoon in September, exactly 6 months ago. Richard had come home late for dinner again with the scent of a perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his shirt. It wasn't the first time. But that night, something in his behavior put me on alert. He was excessively affectionate, too attentive, asking me about my day with a forced interest he hadn't shown in years. When a 68-year-old man who has barely spoken to you in months suddenly wants to know every detail of your visit to the grocery store, you know something is terribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice small changes. Richard would go for walks at night, something he had never done in our 38 years of marriage. His phone, which he used to leave anywhere, he now kept with him at all times, even when he went to the bathroom. But what really confirmed my suspicions was finding a golden earring on the living room sofa. An earring that I immediately recognized because I had given it to Jessica myself for her birthday celebration the previous year. The discovery left me breathless. It wasn't just that Richard was cheating on me. It was that he was doing it with our own son's wife, the woman who sat at my table every Sunday, who called me Mom Helen, with that perfect smile, who had cried in my arms when she had trouble conceiving. For days I walked around the house like a ghost, carrying this terrible secret. Every time Richard kissed me on the cheek before he left for work, every time Jessica arrived with her bright smile and her fake hugs, I felt like they were stabbing daggers into my heart. But it was during Sunday dinner, a week after the earring discovery, that my world was completely rearranged. David had arrived early to help me with dinner, something he rarely did. As I was cutting vegetables in the kitchen, I noticed he was quieter than usual, his movements tense and deliberate. "Mom," he finally said without looking up from the tomatoes he was cutting, "have you noticed anything different about Dad lately?" My heart stopped. How would I respond to that? Would I tell my son that his father was having an affair with his wife? Different in what way? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David put the knife down on the cutting board and looked directly at me. In his eyes, I saw something that surprised me. It wasn't confusion or suspicion. It was knowledge. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," he said softly. We stared at each other in silence for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, I nodded slowly. "How long have you known?" I whispered. 3 months, David replied, his voice heavy with pain and determination. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Jessica started asking strange questions about the household finances, about your daily routine, about when you would be alone. My blood ran cold. What kind of questions? She wanted to know if the house was in both your names, how much money you had in savings, if you had made a will recently. At first, I thought it was normal curiosity. But then she started making comments about how she saw you as fragile lately, as if you were losing your memory. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Jessica was not only having an affair with Richard, she was orchestrating a plan to completely remove me from the equation. "David," my voice trembled, "there's something you need to know." For the next hour, I told him everything. The earring, the perfume, Richard's nightly outings, the whispered phone calls that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. David listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every detail. When I finished, he stared out the kitchen window for long minutes. "Mom," he finally said, "I have a confession to make. I haven't been traveling as much for work as I've told you." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" "For the last 2 months, I've been faking some of those trips. I would stay in a hotel near the airport and secretly come back to watch here when I was supposedly away." The revelation left me speechless. My son had been investigating his own wife and his father. "And what did you discover?" David's expression hardened. "That Jessica comes here at least 3 times a week when I'm supposed to be on a business trip. She stays until very late, sometimes until dawn. And I've heard phone conversations where she talks to someone about speeding up the process and about how you won't be a problem for much longer." Fear took hold of me. What does that mean? I think they're planning more than a simple divorce, Mom. I think they want you to disappear completely from the equation. And I have a feeling that tonight is when they're going to put their plan into motion. I looked at my son, seeing the determination in his eyes, and I realized that I was not alone in this. David had been preparing for this moment as much as I had been suffering for it. "What are we going to do?" I asked. David smiled, but it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who was ready for war. "We're going to give them exactly what they want, Mom. We're going to let them think their plan is working, and when they least expect it, we're going to show them who we really are." That night, as I pretended to sleep next to Richard, I knew that my life was about to change forever. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. As I stood motionless in the hallway, watching David approach stealthily, the memories of the last few weeks took on a new meaning. Every strange conversation, every apparently innocent question from Jessica, every moment of tension that I had attributed to my imagination, it all now fit together like pieces of a sinister puzzle. David stopped next to me, his breathing controlled and silent. In the gloom of the hallway, I could see that he had his phone in his hand, the screen on but silenced. He was recording. "How long had this been going on?" I whispered barely audibly. 8 months, David murmured in my ear. His voice was filled with a contained anger that I had never heard from my son. At first I thought I was paranoid. Jessica started acting strangely after we returned from our vacation in Europe last year. I remembered that vacation. Jessica had come back different, more confident, but also more distant with David. I had attributed the change to the stress of the trip and the problems they had been having conceiving a child. "She started asking questions about you," David continued, keeping his eyes fixed on the living room where Richard and Jessica were still conspiring. "At first, they seemed like normal daughter-in-law worries. Do you think your mother is okay? She seems a little confused lately. Have you noticed she forgets things?" But then the questions became more specific. In the living room, Jessica had approached Richard and was stroking his hair with a familiarity that made me feel nauseous. My robe opened slightly, revealing more than any daughter-in-law should show her father-in-law. "She wanted to know details about the family finances," David whispered. "How much the house was worth, if they had significant savings, if you had made any kind of will or trust." When I asked her why she was so curious, she told me she was worried about your future, that she wanted to make sure you were protected in case something happened to Dad. The irony was cruel. Jessica had used the pretext of protecting me to plan my destruction. "But what really put me on alert," David continued, "was when she started suggesting that maybe Dad and you needed professional help with your marriage. She said she saw you as depressed, that she noticed Dad seemed unhappy, that maybe it would be better if you separated amicably before things got worse." My heart raced as I remembered those conversations. Jessica had planted those seeds so subtly that I had even begun to question my own memory. "That's when I decided to investigate," David murmured. "I hired a private investigator." The revelation hit me like lightning. A private investigator. David nodded without taking his eyes off the room. I needed to know the truth before I accused my own wife of something so terrible. The investigator confirmed what I already suspected. "Jessica comes here every time I'm supposedly on a business trip. She stays for hours, sometimes all night." In the living room, Richard had stood up and was pacing nervously. "I don't know if I can do this, Jessica. Helen has been a good wife for all these years." Jessica laughed with disdain. "A good wife? Richard, look at you. You're 68 years old and you're acting like your life is over. With me, you can be the man you really are, not the boring old man you've become next to her." The words cut me deeply, but David gently squeezed my arm, reminding me that he was there. "But there's more, Mom," David whispered. "Jessica has been in contact with a lawyer specializing in contested divorces. She's been investigating ways to have you declared mentally incompetent." My blood ran cold. "What?" "The investigator discovered that she's been documenting supposed episodes where you say or do strange things. She's been creating a fake record of erratic behavior. Her plan is to use that to argue that you are not competent to make decisions about your own estate." The magnitude of the betrayal left me breathless. Not only were they planning to steal my husband, but also my sanity, my dignity, and my independence. "David," I whispered, "why didn't you tell me anything before?" My son looked at me with eyes full of pain. "Because I needed solid proof, Mom. And because I had to be sure you were prepared for the whole truth." "What whole truth?" David took a deep breath. "Jessica has been stealing money from our joint accounts for months. She's been transferring small amounts to a secret account. Money she planned to use to start a new life with Dad after the divorce. My world swayed. It wasn't just an affair, it was an elaborate and meticulous plan to destroy 2 marriages and steal everything we had built. But here's the part she doesn't know, David continued, a cold smile appearing on his face. 3 months ago, after discovering the first transfers, I changed all of our assets. The house where I live with Jessica, which was in our names, is now only in my name. The savings accounts she thought she could touch in a divorce are protected in a trust. The revelation surprised me. How did you do all that without her realizing? Jessica never really paid attention to the financial details as long as she thought everything was secured. She would sign papers without reading them, trusting that I would never suspect her. I used that trust against her. In the living room, Jessica had started to get dressed, putting on the clothes she had apparently left hidden behind the sofa. Richard watched her with a mixture of disdain and guilt. "We have to talk to her tomorrow," Richard said. "I can't keep living this lie." "Not tomorrow," Jessica replied firmly. "This week. You give her the ultimatum this week, or I'll find another way to solve the problem." David and I exchanged glances. Another way to solve the problem. What exactly did that mean? "David," I whispered, "what are we going to do now?" My son smiled, but there was something different about that smile. Something I had never seen before. It was the smile of someone who had been playing a much longer and more complex game than I had imagined. "Now, Mom, we're going to give them exactly what they want. They're going to get their confrontation, but it's not going to end as they expect." As David spoke, I realized that my son had inherited something more than my green eyes. He had inherited an inner strength that I didn't know he had, a capacity for strategy that made him a formidable opponent. "Are you ready for this?" David asked me. I looked toward the living room where my husband of 38 years and my daughter-in-law were planning my destruction, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. "Power, I'm ready," I whispered. David signaled me to return silently to my room. Once there, he carefully closed the door and turned on the dimmest night lamp. "Mom, I need you to understand something very important," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "What we just witnessed is not just an affair. It's the culmination of a plan that Jessica has been executing for almost a year." I sat in my favorite chair, the one that had been in that corner for the last 15 years, and tried to process everything I had heard. "David, how can a person plan something so calculated?" "Because Jessica is not the person we thought she was," David replied, his voice heavy with a bitterness that broke my heart. "The private investigator discovered things about her past that left me cold." He walked over to his jacket, which he had left hanging on the desk chair, and pulled out a manila folder. "Jessica Johnson is not her real name," he said, opening the folder. "Her name is Victoria Vans, and she has a history of manipulative relationships that ended with older men losing their retirement savings." The words floated in the air like toxic smoke. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my wife is a professional con artist. Mom, before she met me, she was married to a 73-year-old widower in Florida for 2 years. When they divorced, he lost his house and had to move in with his daughter. Before that, there was a man in Nevada, another in Colorado." My hand flew to my chest. "My God, David, how could you not have known any of this?" "Because she's very good at what she does," David replied bitterly. "She legally changed her name 5 years ago. She created a completely new personal history. She even has fake references from previous jobs. When we met at that work conference, I thought I had been lucky enough to find the perfect woman. I remembered the day David introduced me to Jessica. It had been 4 years ago, and she seemed genuinely in love with him. Her eyes sparkled when she looked at him. Her laugh seemed sincere, and the way she talked about their plans for the future together had convinced me that she was the ideal woman for my son. "When did you start to suspect?" I asked. "It wasn't really until 6 months ago. At first I thought her questions about the family were normal, but then she started making specific comments about your behavior. Mom, she would say things like, 'Your mother seemed confused when I talked to her yesterday,' or 'I think your mother is starting to show signs of her age.'" My stomach clenched. I remembered those conversations. Jessica had sowed those doubts so subtly that I had even begun to question my own memory. "But what really put me on alert," David continued, "was when I found a notebook in her purse. She was documenting supposed episodes of yours. She would write things like, Helen didn't remember we had talked about Sunday dinner, or Helen seemed confused about what day it was when I called her. The horror invaded me. She was creating false evidence. Exactly. And not only that, she was also documenting the family finances. She had a detailed list of all our assets, the value of this house, Dad's savings accounts. She had even investigated how much the investments were worth. I got up and started walking around the room trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. And your father? Do you think he knows who she really is? David shook his head. Dad is as much a victim as we are, Mom. Jessica seduced him in the same way she seduced me. She made him feel young again, desired, important. But he has no idea that he is being manipulated into a specific plan. A new realization hit me. David, if she's done this before, what happened to those other men? David's expression darkened. The widower in Florida ended up in a nursing home. After she convinced a judge that he was not competent to manage his own finances, the man in Nevada died under suspicious circumstances 6 months after the divorce was finalized. My blood ran cold. You're insinuating that I can't prove anything, Mom. But the pattern is clear. Jessica finds vulnerable men, manipulates them into falling in love with her, and then systematically destroys them. And now she has her sights set on our family. I sat down again, my legs shaking. What are we going to do? We can't just go to the police with suspicions? David smiled, but it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had been preparing for a war. That's why we've been waiting for tonight, Mom. We needed Jessica to feel confident enough to show her true intentions. We needed concrete evidence of her plan. Evidence. David raised his phone. I've been recording everything they said tonight, but that's just the beginning. He went to my dresser and opened the bottom drawer. To my surprise, he pulled out a small electronic device. I've been recording all their conversations in this house for the last 6 weeks, he said calmly. I have hours of evidence of Jessica and Dad planning how to get you out of the picture. My jaw dropped. You've been spying on your own house? Not just my house, Mom. Also her phone, her emails, her bank accounts. All legally, of course. As her husband, I have access to our joint accounts, and as the owner of our house, I have the right to install security systems. The transformation of my son left me speechless. The gentle and trusting David I knew had developed a strategic and ruthless side that I had never seen. David, I whispered, how did you learn to do all this? When you discover that the person you trusted most in the world has been lying to you from the first day you met her, you learn to be very careful. His voice hardened in response. I hired not only a private investigator, but also a lawyer specializing in marital fraud and a forensic accountant. My son had built an entire team of professionals to protect us. Mom, there's something else you need to know. David continued. Jessica doesn't know that we've changed all our assets. In the papers she's seen, it still looks like Dad and you have joint access to everything. But the reality is that 3 months ago, I legally transferred all the important assets to your name only. The shock left me speechless. What does that mean? It means that if Dad tries to divorce you and claim half of the assets, he's going to get a very nasty surprise. The house, the savings accounts, the investments, everything is protected in a trust in your name. A mixture of relief and disbelief invaded me. How did you do all that without Richard realizing? Dad signed all the papers without reading them. Mom, I told him they were routine insurance and estate planning updates. He was so distracted with his affair that he didn't pay attention to what he was signing. At that moment, we heard footsteps in the hallway. David quickly put away all the documents and signaled me to get into bed. Tomorrow night, he whispered, they're going to confront you. They're planning to give you an ultimatum. But this time, Mom, we're going to be ready. As I lay down and pretended to sleep, Richard entered the room silently. I felt him slide into bed beside me, and for the first time in 38 years of marriage, his presence disgusted me. But it also filled me with a determination that I had not felt in decades. Tomorrow night, Jessica and Richard were going to show their true faces, and we would be waiting for them. The next night arrived like a storm that had been brewing for months. All day, Richard had been nervous, checking his phone constantly and avoiding eye contact with me. Jessica had called 3 times during the afternoon, whispered conversations that Richard took in the garage. David came to dinner as we had planned, but this time there was nothing casual about his visit. He was carrying a small recorder in his shirt pocket and had discreetly placed his phone on the fireplace mantel with the camera pointing towards the living room. "Are you ready for this, Mom?" he asked me as we were doing the dishes together. I nodded, although my hands were trembling slightly. All my life I have avoided confrontations, David. But tonight, for the first time, I have weapons to fight with. Richard had been exceptionally silent during dinner, pushing food around on his plate without actually eating. When we finished, he retired to his study, where I heard him make a 20-minute phone call. At 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. David and I exchanged glances. We had been waiting for this moment, but my heart still started to beat faster. "Go ahead, Mom," David murmured. "Remember, you don't have to pretend you don't know what's going on. Tonight, we're going to let them show who they really are." I opened the door to find Jessica standing there with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was wearing an elegant black dress and high heels, as if she had dressed for a special occasion. "Hello, Mom Helen," she said with that sweet voice that I now knew was completely false. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Richard is in his study. Why don't you come into the living room?" Jessica entered, her heels echoing on the wooden floor. David appeared from the kitchen, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, hi, Jessica. I didn't know you were coming tonight." Jessica tensed slightly. "David, what are you doing here?" "I came to have dinner with Mom," David replied casually. "Is there a problem?" Before Jessica could answer, Richard appeared from his study. His face was pale, and I could see the sweat on his forehead. "Helen," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we all need to talk." We headed to the living room where Jessica sat on the sofa with a confidence that made me feel nauseous. Richard remained standing near the fireplace, unable to sit down. "Helen," Richard began, avoiding my gaze, "there are things that have been changing in our marriage." "What kind of things?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Jessica leaned forward, her mask of concern perfectly in place. "Mom, Helen, we've all noticed that you've been a little confused lately, forgetting conversations, losing things. Richard is worried about you." David tensed beside me, but didn't say anything. We had agreed to let Jessica dig her own grave. "Confused?" I repeated. "Can you give me specific examples?" Jessica took a small notebook from her purse. My heart raced as I recognized it. It was the same notebook David had seen, where she had been documenting my supposed episodes of confusion. "Well," she said, consulting her notes, "last week you told me you didn't remember that we had talked about Sunday dinner, and last month you seemed confused about what day it was when I called you." The performance was impressive. Her voice was full of genuine concern. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears. "And I've noticed things too," Richard finally added, finding his voice. "You forget where you put your keys, you repeat the same stories. Sometimes you seem lost in your own house." I looked at my husband of 38 years, the man who had promised to love and protect me until death do us part, and I saw a stranger who was trying to convince me that I was losing my mind. "I understand," I said calmly. "And what do you propose to do about it?" Jessica and Richard exchanged glances. It was the signal they had been waiting for. "Well," Jessica said, her voice becoming slightly more firm, "Richard and I have been talking, and we believe that maybe it would be better if you had a little more help." "What kind of help?" Richard finally came closer, sitting on the edge of the coffee table. "Helen, I think we should consider assisted living options, places where you can have the care you need." The silence in the room was deafening. David had stopped moving completely, like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. "Assisted living," I repeated slowly. "It's for your own good, Mom," Jessica added quickly. "There are very nice places where you could be comfortable and safe, and Richard could visit you every day." "Of course," Richard added. "This would mean we would have to make some arrangements with the house and finances to ensure you have the best possible care." There was the real motive behind this whole farce. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. Jessica leaned forward, her eyes shining with a greed that she no longer bothered to hide completely. "Well, the house is too big for one person alone. Richard could sell it and use the money to pay for your long-term care. And of course," Richard added, "I would make sure you're comfortable. Maybe I could get a smaller apartment, something more manageable." David finally spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "An apartment for you alone, Dad. Or are you planning to share it with someone?" Richard paled. "What do you mean by that?" I think you know exactly what I mean," David replied, slowly getting up. Jessica tensed. "David, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. We're just trying to do what's best for your mother." "Seriously?" David smiled, but there was no humor in it. "How did you come to do what's best for my mother at 3 a.m. last night?" The color drained completely from Jessica's face. Richard stood up abruptly. "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered. David walked over to the fireplace and picked up his phone. "I'm talking about this," he said, pressing play on a recording. Jessica's voice filled the room. "Accept the divorce settlement or go live on the street. Helen is no longer of any use to you. She's old, boring, and frankly, she's becoming a burden." Jessica stood up like a spring, her composure finally breaking. "That recording was taken without my consent. It's illegal." "Actually," David said calmly, "recording conversations on my mother's property is completely legal, especially when you're conspiring to defraud her." Richard began to back away towards the door. "This is a misunderstanding. Can I explain?" "Can you explain this too?" David pressed play on another recording. This time it was Richard's voice. "We can always say she's losing her mind. At her age, no one would question a diagnosis of early onset dementia." The silence that followed was absolute. Jessica and Richard looked at each other like trapped animals. Then Jessica did something I didn't expect. She laughed. "Fine," she said, her voice becoming cold and calculating. "Do you think this changes anything? Do you think some recordings are going to stop what's already in motion?" She went to her purse and took out an envelope. "Dear Helen, we have already filed a legal petition to have you declared mentally incompetent. I have 6 months of documentation of erratic behavior on your part." My blood ran cold, but David smiled. "You mean this documentation?" he asked, pulling Jessica's notebook from his jacket. Jessica paled. "How? How did you get that?" "Because I'm your husband, Jessica. Or should I say Victoria Vans?" The name hung in the air like a bomb. "Jessica! Victoria!" She staggered backwards. "That's right," David continued. "I know exactly who you are. I know what happened to Harold Morrison in Florida. I know what happened to James Peterson in Nevada. And now I know what you were planning to do to my family." Victoria had become completely motionless, like a wild animal assessing her escape options. Richard, completely confused, looked between David and Victoria. "What are you talking about? Who is Victoria Vans?" "Ask your girlfriend," David said coldly. "Ask her about her other 3 marriages. Ask her about the men who ended up in nursing homes after meeting her." Victoria finally found her voice. But there was no longer any trace of the sweet Jessica I had known for 4 years. "You people have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice full of venom. "This doesn't end here. 6 months later, I am sitting in my new garden sipping my morning coffee while I watch the birds that have made their nests in the oak tree I planted last month. The house is smaller than the previous one, but it is completely mine. Every room, every piece of furniture, every decision has been chosen by me and for me." The transformation was not instantaneous or easy, but it was inevitable once all the cards were on the table. That night of confrontation, after Victoria threatened that this didn't end there, David had smiled with a calmness that surprised me. "You're right, Victoria," he had said. "This doesn't end here. It ends at the police station, where my lawyer has already filed charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit elder fraud." Victoria's face had completely fallen apart. Richard, finally understanding the magnitude of what had been happening, had sunk into the sofa like a broken man. "Elder fraud," he had whispered. "Yes, Dad," David had replied. His voice was filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "Your girlfriend is a professional con artist who specializes in manipulating older men to steal their retirement savings." What followed were weeks of legal proceedings, depositions, and revelations that made the initial betrayal seem like just the tip of the iceberg. Victoria had been planning not only to get me out of the house, but also to convince Richard to have me institutionalized in a mental facility where she would have total control over our assets through a power of attorney she had been preparing. David's private investigator had discovered that Victoria had a network of accomplices, a corrupt lawyer specializing in mental incompetence cases, a psychiatrist willing to diagnose dementia based solely on the testimony of family members, even an administrator at a long-term care facility who was willing to keep me sedated and isolated for a monthly fee. Richard, confronted with the evidence that he had been manipulated into a plan to destroy his own wife, had a complete nervous breakdown. For days he had cried, begged for forgiveness, and insisted that he never would have allowed me to be harmed. But the damage was already done. Not the damage Victoria had planned, but something deeper. The trust that had been the foundation of our marriage for 38 years had completely evaporated. "I can't keep living with you, Richard," I had told him one morning, 2 weeks after the confrontation. "Not because I can't forgive you, but because I no longer know who you are." He had cried then, genuine tears from a man who finally understood what he had lost, but tears could not repair what was broken. The divorce was amicable in the end. Richard, overwhelmed by guilt and the shock of discovering that he had been manipulated into destroying his own family, asked for nothing. He signed all the papers David put in front of him, transferring his portion of all our assets to my name. "It's the least I can do," he had murmured as he signed the deed to the house. "After all you've endured because of me." Victoria, of course, did not go quietly. She hired a lawyer and tried to argue that the recordings had been obtained illegally, that David had violated her privacy, that she was the real victim in the whole situation. But David had been too meticulous. Every recording had been made on family property. Every investigation had been conducted legally. Every asset transfer had been properly documented. Victoria faced charges in 3 different states. Once the investigation revealed the full extent of her activities, the widower from Florida, who had lost his house, testified against her. The family of the man from Nevada, who had died under mysterious circumstances, filed a civil lawsuit. In the end, Victoria was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for systematic fraud. Her network of accomplices also faced charges, although some cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. David divorced her while she was awaiting trial. Since we had transferred all the marital assets before her arrest, Victoria received nothing from the settlement. "How do you feel about it?" I had asked David the day the divorce papers were finalized. "Relieved," he had replied without excitement. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. I don't have to walk on eggshells in my own house. I don't have to question every word I say." Richard moved into a small apartment near downtown. He tried to visit me several times during the first few months, but our conversations were forced and uncomfortable. We finally agreed that it was better to keep our distance. "Do you think you'll ever be able to completely forgive me?" he had asked me during his last visit. "I've already forgiven you, Richard," I had replied honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we have to rebuild what was broken." He had nodded, finally understanding that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired simply with repentance. Now 6 months later, I have found a peace that I didn't know was possible. I live in a 2-bedroom house, in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors know each other by name, but respect each other's privacy. I have a small but thriving garden where I grow tomatoes, herbs, and flowers that attract butterflies. David visits me 2 times a week for dinner. Our relationship has deepened in ways I never expected. Without the constant tension of Victoria manipulating family situations, without the guilt and confusion that had characterized the last few years, we have rediscovered how much we really like each other as people. "Do you ever regret not having fought for the marriage?" he asked me last night as we were doing the dishes together. "No," I replied without excitement. "I fought for my marriage for 38 years. What Richard chose in the end was not our marriage. It was something completely different." David nodded. "I think you're the strongest woman I know, Mom." I laughed softly. "I don't feel strong. I feel free, and it's true. For the first time in decades, I don't have to consider anyone else's needs or opinions when making decisions about my life. If I want to have dinner at 5 in the afternoon, I do. If I want to read until 2 in the morning, there's no one snoring next to me to stop me. If I want to spend the whole day in my pajamas watching old movies, there's no one to judge me. But more than the practical freedom, I have found something more valuable: self-respect. For years, I had allowed small humiliations and inconsiderations to accumulate, telling myself that was what marital compromise meant. I had accepted being taken for granted because I believed that was what good wives did. Now I understand that true love never requires you to sacrifice your dignity. True respect never comes with manipulation, and true family never conspires to destroy you. Victoria made a fundamental mistake in her plan. She assumed I was a weak and defenseless old woman, easy to manipulate and discard. She didn't calculate that I would have a son who would protect me with the ferocity of a warrior, nor that I myself would have the inner strength to rebuild my life from scratch at 64 years old. Last night, as I was reading in my new bed, in my new room, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard Richard's broken voice. "Helen," he had whispered, "I just wanted you to know that I think about you every day and that I regret what I did to you more than words can express." "I know." "Richard," I had replied gently, "and I hope you find peace." "Have you found it?" he had asked. I looked around my small room with its walls painted the lavender color I had always loved, but which Richard had considered too feminine for our old house. I looked at my books organized exactly as I liked, my clothes hung without having to make space for suits that were rarely worn, my nightstand with only my own things. "Yes," I had replied, "I have definitely found it." After hanging up, I stayed awake a little longer, not because I was upset or worried, but because I wanted to savor the silence of a house where there are no secrets, where there are no lies whispered in the early hours of the morning, where there are no plans being made behind my back. It is a golden silence, full of possibilities instead of fears. Tomorrow, David and I are going to visit a new art museum that opened downtown. The next week, I'm going to start a watercolor painting class that I had always wanted to take, but for which I had never found the time. At 64, I am finally living my own life, and it is beautiful. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Comment below from which city you're watching me. I'll be reading everything.